The weight of silence. The world saw him as a star, a man with kindness in his eyes and quiet strength in his voice. But behind the calm smile and the humble way he carried himself, there was a silence that followed Keanu Reeves everywhere. It was the silence of someone who had walked through shadows most people could not imagine. It was the silence of someone who had known love, but also deep loss, and who carried that story in his heart like a scar that never healed. The story begins not on a red carpet or a movie set, but in a quiet room late at night. Keanu sat by the window, watching the city lights spread like stars across the darkness. His phone buzzed with messages, requests, and reminders, but he ignored them all. He had been surrounded by noise for years. Yet at times like this, the silence felt heavier than the fame. He whispered to himself, almost like a confession, "Maybe I will never marry again." For those who only knew the image, the words would have sounded strange. Why would a man admired by millions, loved for his generosity, respected for his work, and surrounded by opportunities, say something like that? But his words carried the weight of a story that most of the world had only heard in fragments. A story of dreams broken, of love found and lost, of promises that turned into ashes. When Keanu was young, love came to him with fire and hope. He believed in it the way a child believes in the sun rising every morning. He imagined a life where laughter filled the rooms, where quiet mornings turned into long evenings, and where simple moments became treasures. He had once thought that love would give him a family, a partner to share his journey, someone to remind him that behind the roles and the fame, he was just a man who wanted to be understood. But love is never simple. The woman he once loved, Jennifer, gave him joy that seemed endless. Together, they dreamed of a life that felt ordinary yet magical. When they discovered they were expecting a child, Keanu felt a happiness he had never known before. He imagined himself holding his baby, whispering promises of safety, teaching them kindness and walking beside them through every step of life. But life does not always follow the path we imagine. The baby was stillborn and their world collapsed in silence. The pain was more than loss. It was like standing in a storm that refused to end. Grief became their shadow. And soon after, tragedy struck again when Jennifer's life was also taken too soon in an accident. Keanu never spoke much about it. He never needed to. The pain was written in the way he walked through the world, gentle but distant, kind but guarded. He gave to others. He listened. He offered kindness like water to those who were thirsty. But in his own heart, he carried emptiness. It was not bitterness. It was not anger. It was simply a quiet acceptance that some wounds never fully heal. Yet even with all that pain, Keanu did not close himself from the world. He kept working, he kept giving, he kept living with humility. People would meet him on the subway, in small cafes, walking through the streets with no bodyguards, no walls. Just a man who treated strangers like equals. And still, when asked about love, about marriage, his answer always returned to the same truth. Maybe I will never marry again. Not because he did not believe in love, but because he had already lived its deepest beauty and its deepest sorrow. He respected it too much to pretend. As he sat by the window that night, he remembered the laughter, the small touches, the dreams that never came true. He remembered how fragile life was, how quickly everything could change, and he knew that his silence was not emptiness, it was respect. Respect for the love he once had. Respect for the fragility of life. Respect for the pain that shaped him. In that silence, there was also resilience. He had not given up on living, even when life had given him every reason to stop. This is the story of Keanu Reeves. Not the actor on the screen, but the man behind the silence. A man who taught the world that strength is not always loud, that kindness is not weakness, and that even the deepest pain can shape a heart into something beautiful. And as his journey unfolds, we begin to understand why his words carry such weight. Maybe I will never marry again was not sadness. It was truth. And in that truth there was a lesson for everyone who listened. The man who walks alone fame had never been his dream. Keanu Reeves never chased the spotlight, even though it followed him everywhere. When he walked into a room, people noticed his calm presence. When he stepped onto a set, directors trusted him, co-stars respected him, and fans adored him. Yet in the quiet hours, he often walked the streets alone, blending into crowds like a man without a name. He rode the subway, bought coffee in small shops, stood in line like everyone else, and many wondered why a man with such success chose such simplicity. But Keanu knew why. Simplicity was not a choice. It was survival. It was the only way to carry his pain without letting it drown him. He remembered a day in New York where rain fell heavy on the streets. People rushed with umbrellas trying to escape the storm, but Keanu walked slowly, letting the rain soak his clothes. It was not sadness that made him do it. It was his way of feeling alive. Every drop reminded him that the world was still here, that even in loss there was life moving forward. A stranger recognized him that day, hesitated, then smiled nervously. Keanu smiled back, his soaked hair sticking to his forehead. The stranger expected arrogance, maybe distance, but instead received warmth. A small nod that said, "I see you." That moment stayed with the stranger forever, but for Keanu, it was just natural. He had lost too much to ever treat people as if they were invisible. In Hollywood, people whispered about him. They called him mysterious, private, even strange at times. Why did he not live in mansions filled with parties? Why did he give away so much of his earnings to crew members, to charities, to hospitals? Why did he never boast about his kindness? Keanu never answered those questions. He did not need to. For him, life was never about showing the world who you are. It was about quietly being true to yourself, even when no one was watching. Still, the silence around his love life drew constant questions. Reporters asked if he was dating. Fans wondered if he was lonely. Magazines wrote stories that tried to guess his heart. Keanu only gave small smiles, soft words, and never revealed too much. But deep inside, every question felt like a weight pressing on a scar that had never fully healed. He knew people meant no harm, but they did not understand that for him, love was sacred. It was not something to display, not something to sell, and not something he could easily replace. There were nights when he sat in his apartment, surrounded by books and old photographs. He would pick up a picture of Jennifer, her smile frozen in time, and whisper words only he could hear. Sometimes he asked why. Sometimes he said thank you. Sometimes he just sat in silence, staring at the image, letting memories play in his mind. He knew the world thought he was alone, but he never felt truly alone. Her memory lived inside him, and though it hurt, it also gave him strength. His friends often admired his resilience. They told him he was brave for carrying so much loss yet still moving forward. But Keanu never saw himself as brave. He saw himself as human, fragile, flawed, just trying to keep walking. He once told a close friend, "Grief never leaves you. It stays with you like a companion. You just learn how to live with it." These words were not spoken for fame, not for interviews, not for applause. They were spoken with honesty. The kind of honesty that only comes from someone who has looked at life from both its brightest and darkest corners. As years passed, Keanu built a reputation not just as an actor, but as a man of kindness. He gave up his seat for strangers, stopped to listen to fans, donated quietly without making headlines. But behind every act of kindness there was an invisible story. He knew what it felt like to hurt. He knew what it felt like to lose. And so whenever he saw someone struggling, even in small ways, he gave what he could because he understood. But still, marriage remained a question he avoided. People wanted him to find happiness again, to see him with a partner, to believe in a new love story. Keanu, however, lived with a different truth. "Maybe I will never marry again" was not bitterness. It was not rejection of love. It was simply the acceptance that some stories once lived cannot be repeated. He had loved deeply once, and even though it ended in tragedy, it shaped him into the man he was. The world only saw the star, the roles, the movies that inspired millions. But the man himself knew that his greatest role was not on a screen. It was how he carried his grief with dignity, how he respected love even in loss, and how he kept walking alone, with kindness in every step. This was Keanu Reeves, an actor, yes, but more importantly, a man who reminded the world that strength is not about hiding pain. Strength is about carrying it with grace and still choosing to be kind. The kindness that no one sees. The cameras often caught him in moments that felt ordinary. A photograph of Keanu sitting alone on a park bench eating a sandwich quietly. Another picture of him giving up his subway seat to a stranger. A video of him helping someone carry bags across a street. The world shared these moments, calling him the internet's kindest man. But what most people never understood was that these small gestures were not for attention. They were part of who he was. Kindness was not an act. It was his way of breathing. Behind that kindness, however, was something deeper. Keanu carried the belief that pain teaches us to see others more clearly. He once explained to a friend, "When you lose so much, you start noticing how heavy the world can be for other people too." This was why he reached out, why he gave without asking for anything back. He had already felt the weight of silence, the sharpness of loss, and he could not ignore it when he saw even a shadow of that pain in others. On film sets, crew members whispered stories about him. Once, during a long shoot, he heard that some workers were struggling with bills. Quietly, without announcement, he gave them bonuses that changed their lives. When a stunt team worked tirelessly on dangerous sequences, he bought them motorcycles as a thank you gift. But he never bragged, never let it be used as publicity. He always insisted they deserve it. To him, every person mattered. It did not matter if they held a camera, carried equipment, or stood beside him on screen. He treated them with the same respect. The humility shocked many in Hollywood, a place where ego often ruled. Yet Keanu's quiet ways set him apart. He rarely attended glamorous events, often dressed in simple clothes, and walked red carpets without the usual air of power. He was present but never demanding. He smiled at fans, signed autographs with patience, and made people feel seen. In a world of bright lights, he chose to remain grounded in shadows. Still, there were moments when kindness carried its own burden. Some people misunderstood it. They thought his simplicity meant loneliness. They assumed his generosity meant he was searching for something to fill his own emptiness. But Keanu never gave to heal himself. He gave because he believed that life was too short to withhold kindness. He understood how quickly everything could be taken away, and he wanted to leave behind traces of light wherever he walked. Yet even with all this, he often found himself reflecting on the question that followed him everywhere. Would he ever marry again? Strangers asked it, reporters hinted at it, even close friends whispered it. But every time, the answer returned to the same quiet truth inside him. Love was not something he could replace. It was not a box to be checked or a duty to fulfill. Love to him was sacred, fragile, and once broken, it could never be forced again. There was an evening when he spoke softly to a small group of friends about this. They sat in a circle, sharing stories, laughter, and memories. When the conversation turned to love, someone asked him directly, "Don't you think you deserve a second chance?" Keanu smiled gently, looked down at his hands, and after a pause replied, "Maybe love is not about deserving. Maybe it is about respecting what was already given." The room grew quiet. No one argued, because in that moment, his words carried a truth too heavy to challenge. But Keanu's story was not just about loss or the refusal to marry again. It was also about resilience. Despite the tragedies, despite the silence, he kept showing up. He kept acting, creating, and inspiring. He poured himself into characters that reflected pieces of his soul. Men who struggled, men who fought for something greater than themselves, men who endured. Audiences connected to those roles not only because of the scripts, but because they could feel the reality behind his eyes. His grief made his art more powerful. His kindness made his presence unforgettable, and his humility made his story universal. Millions looked at him and saw not just a celebrity but a mirror of their own struggles. People who had lost loved ones, people who walked alone, people who carried pain quietly. They found comfort in knowing that even someone admired by the world could understand what they were feeling. This was the paradox of Keanu Reeves. The more he lived in silence, the more his silence spoke to others. The more he walked alone, the more people felt connected to him. And the more he resisted the idea of marriage again, the more his words carried lessons about respect, grief, and the kind of love that never truly ends. The world listens to his silence. Keanu Reeves never shouted his story to the world, but the world listened anyway. People searched his interviews, studied his gestures, and shared quotes that seemed to reveal pieces of his heart. Some of those quotes went viral because they carried truths that were rare in a world of noise. When he said, "Grief never ends, it changes shape," millions nodded silently, understanding. When he spoke of kindness, when he reminded people that simple gestures matter, it reached across continents. He was not a preacher, not a man trying to build followers. He was simply honest, and honesty had a way of piercing through the noise. There was a time when a journalist asked him about happiness. It was a harmless question, one asked countless times to countless stars, but Keanu did not give the expected answer. He paused, looked down for a moment, then said softly, "Every day I wake up and I try to be grateful. Happiness is not about getting everything. It's about noticing the small things you still have." The silence after his words felt heavier than applause. Millions later watched that clip, many with tears in their eyes because his truth echoed theirs. The irony was that his silence spoke louder than most people's voices. When he avoided the spotlight, people respected him more. When he refused to boast about his kindness became legendary. When he said little about love, people felt the weight of his honesty. In a world desperate for noise, his quiet dignity was like a rare song. Still, Keanu often wondered why people cared so much about his story. He did not see himself as extraordinary. He saw himself as a man who had stumbled, suffered, and survived. And maybe that was the reason. The world did not just admire his movies. They admired the way he carried life itself, without complaint, without arrogance, without the need to appear perfect. There was a night when he stood on a stage, not as an actor playing a role, but as a speaker at a charity event. The room was filled with wealthy donors, celebrities, and bright lights. Yet when he began to speak, his words were simple, almost fragile. He talked about loss, about kindness, about how fragile life could be. He did not use complex language or grand gestures. He simply spoke from his own scars. And when he finished, the room was silent before the applause came. People were not clapping for a star. They were clapping for a human being who had reminded them of something they had forgotten, that even in pain, dignity and kindness can survive. But outside of stages and cameras, his life remained simple. He still sat alone in cafes, still walked in quiet neighborhoods, still chose peace over luxury. When asked why, he once said, "I just want to live life, not chase it." These words reflected his truth. He did not fear loneliness. He feared losing authenticity. He knew how easy it was for fame to steal one's soul, and he had no intention of letting that happen. And yet, despite all his resilience, there were moments when the past returned sharply. A song, a place, a memory could bring back the weight of grief. Sometimes while driving late at night, he felt the presence of what he had lost so close that he had to pull over and sit in silence, letting the memories wash over him. Those were private battles the world never saw, but they shaped him, and they gave him the strength to keep moving with grace. His refusal to marry again was not the closing of a door. It was a way of honoring the love that had already shaped his soul. And the more people tried to push him toward a new love story, the more he stood quietly in his truth. It was not rejection of hope. It was acceptance of reality. Love had carved itself into him once, and he chose to carry that carving with respect. People may have wanted a fairy tale, but Keanu offered something rarer. He offered honesty. And in that honesty, he gave the world permission to embrace their own scars, to respect their own grief, and to find dignity in simply surviving. The weight of respect. Keanu Reeves had built a life where respect guided every step he took. Respect for others, respect for silence, and most of all, respect for love. When people asked him why he chose to remain single, why he might never marry again, his answer was not about fear or rejection. It was about respect. He had loved once so deeply that it became a part of him forever, and to him, pretending that it could be replaced felt dishonest. This truth was not easy for others to accept. Many people wanted to believe in new beginnings and happy endings and second chances that erased the pain of the past. But Keanu lived with a different understanding. He knew that sometimes life does not erase pain. It teaches you how to carry it. He had learned that some scars never fade, and that was not something to be ashamed of. It was something to honor. He often spoke about time, how it changes the way we see love and grief. Time does not heal everything, he once said quietly in an interview. It just teaches you how to live with it. Those words resonated because they were not the promises people wanted to hear, but the truth they needed. Millions watched that clip, and for many it felt like Keanu had put into words the feelings they had carried but could not express. His life was full of contradictions. He was surrounded by millions of fans, yet he often walked alone. He was one of the most successful actors in the world, yet he lived like a man untouched by fame. He had faced loss that could have broken him completely, yet he chose kindness again and again. These contradictions did not make him weak. They made him human in a world that often forgot what humanity truly was. One evening, after a long day of filming, Keanu sat with a small group of cast and crew members. They were tired, eating simple food, sharing stories to pass the time. Someone asked him what he believed was the most important thing in life. He paused, looking down at his plate, then lifted his eyes with a calm expression. "To treat people with respect," he said, "because you never know what someone is carrying inside." The group fell silent, and in that silence they realized he was speaking not from theory, but from experience. But respect also meant respecting his own heart. While the world wanted to see him in another love story, he did not allow himself to be pressured by expectation. He knew that rushing into love, just to fit an image of happiness, would be unfair both to him and to anyone who entered his life, and so he chose honesty. He chose silence. He chose the path that was harder but truer. His humility only deepened this respect. He never acted as though his pain was greater than anyone else's. When fans shared their own losses with him, he listened with compassion. He did not interrupt with his own story. He simply nodded, sometimes placed a gentle hand on their shoulder and offered a few words of encouragement. His presence reminded them that they were not alone, and that even someone admired by millions could understand their pain. There was a story told by a fan who met him on a rainy evening. She was crying, struggling with her own heartbreak when Keanu walked past her. He stopped, asked softly if she was okay, and when she said she had lost someone she loved, he simply sat with her for a few minutes in silence. No advice, no speeches, just presence. Later, she said that his quiet company helped her breathe again. For Keanu, it was a small moment. For her, it was everything. Through these small acts, through his quiet honesty, Keanu built a legacy greater than fame. It was not his movies that defined him, but his humanity. He became proof that resilience is not about pretending you are unbroken. It is about carrying your broken pieces with grace. And so, when he said he might never marry again, it was not the story of a man who gave up on love. It was the story of a man who loved so deeply that he refused to treat it lightly. It was not the ending of a chapter. It was the respect of a chapter that would live inside him forever. The legacy of quiet strength. The years passed, but Keanu Reeves remained the same in ways that mattered most. He aged, his hair turned gray, his face carried new lines, but his soul stayed steady. He still lived with humility, still walked with kindness, and still carried the quiet dignity that set him apart. The world continued to watch him, admire him, and wonder about the man behind the silence. People asked him about success, about fame, about love. But Keanu's answers never changed much. He spoke softly with respect, choosing words that carried weight instead of noise. When asked again about marriage, his response was the same truth he had carried for years. Maybe I will never marry again. The world listened not with disappointment but with understanding. Because by now people had begun to see what those words really meant. They meant respect for the love he once had. They meant honesty about the scars he carried. They meant acceptance of life's fragile nature. And most of all, they meant that Keanu Reeves lived by truth, not expectation. His story was not about tragedy alone. It was about resilience. It was about a man who had faced some of life's cruelest storms and still chose to stand, still chose to give, still chose to be kind. He never denied his grief, but he never let it define him. Instead, he turned it into a reminder that life, however fragile, is still worth living. Fans who met him often described the same feeling. They said being near him felt calming, like being seen without judgment. They said his presence carried both strength and gentleness, as if he understood pain in a way that made people feel safe around him. This became his quiet gift to the world. Not just his movies, but his humanity. His legacy was not built in the spotlight. It was built in quiet subway rides, in small acts of kindness, in conversations where he listened more than he spoke. It was built in the way he respected life, respected others, and respected the love that had once shaped his heart. Keanu's journey taught something rare in today's world. That strength is not always about moving forward quickly, that happiness is not always about filling emptiness, and that love, once lived deeply, never truly dies. The internet called him the kindest man in Hollywood, but the truth was greater. He was not trying to be kind for the world to see. He was simply living as a man who understood pain and who chose every day to answer pain with kindness instead of bitterness. And so, as his story reached the hearts of millions, people realized that his refusal to marry again was not a sad ending. It was a powerful reminder of respect, humility, and resilience. It was the story of a man who carried grief with dignity, who loved without apology, and who gave the world a lesson greater than any movie could teach. Keanu Reeves, the man who may never marry again, had already given something far more lasting than a wedding ring or a love story. He had given the world an example of how to live with grace, even when life takes away what you love most.